good.
I'm ready.
I'm ready too.
All right, lovely.
Yeah, Tyler, it's great to meet you. I'm very happy
The pleasure's mine, Hans. Thank you
do
very
this
much.
conversation here. And I thought we should maybe begin with the beginning,
Okay.
with the very beginning. And I was also curious how you came to art, or how art came to you. If that was a kind of a revelation, a sudden revelation, or if it was a gradual process. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, art has always been a part of my life. I grew up drawing and painting. I was lucky enough to have some private painting instruction when I was younger, some painting tutors. I did not go to art school. My father was a little more pragmatic, and he really guided me towards studying computer science instead, which was also an interest of mine. So I have a degree in computer science, and worked as a programmer for some time, but always continued making artwork in the background, and it was always a real passion of mine. And in my early 20s, I really decided that that's what I wanted to put my best energy into. And so I kind of went back into studying really traditional figure drawing for a couple of years. But for me, the real revelation was when I decided to try to combine programming with artwork. That was the first time that the art sort of felt like it became mine, and it felt like it became something new and interesting to me. And at the time, I wasn't even aware of generative art, which I think in some ways was a blessing, because it allowed me to sort of enter this mode of creation my own way. And ever since then, I've really been focused on generative artwork.
Great, and that's maybe also interesting to then know in a way where your catalog actually begins, where's the first work you were happy with. But before that, I wanted to ask you a bit maybe about artists who inspired you, and it's not necessarily a genealogy, because that's too linear. And
right.
Alexis Pauline-Gams wrote this great book on Sylvia Wynter called Dub, where she says it's not necessarily about the influence of Sylvia Wynter on her, but it's more about her thinking with Sylvia Wynter. Okay. And I think artists often work with artists from the past. The future is invented with fragments from the past. And
absolutely.
I spoke last night, I had a midnight interview last night with Jim Jarmusch, and he talked about, all these things from the past which are always there, like William Blake, or he talked about the New York School of Poets, John Ashbery, and it would always be with him in a way, and he would work with that. So I kind of wanted to ask you, in that sense, not so much were you influenced by, but whom are you working with?
Whom am I working with? Yeah,
from the past, you know?
Wonderful question.
Because I know that Cage somehow is there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I do consider myself to be working with and on a lot of the ideas that were started by painters, decades ago. I think there's kind of several answers to that question. In some ways, I think the abstract expressionists, especially the New York abstract expressionists, the sort of energy in their work and the way that their work so directly speaks to the viewer and doesn't necessarily rely on conceptual backing to be appreciated. That's something that I think is a value that I try to instill in my work, and still, even with this work that does have a conceptual basis, I still try to carry that with me. I think Agnes Martin has really affected the way that I create my work. Not necessarily stylistically, but in the way that she thought and talked about her work, and in the way that she sort of sought a particular effect from the work, or a particular connection with the artist or the viewer in the work, and didn't care so much about the intellectual backing behind the work. Even though I know my work does have a strong intellectual component to it, I still really value sort of the way that she looked at work, and try to think about that often. Of course, every artist that's worked with a computer in some way, my work is related to. I talk a lot as well about every painter, in developing a style. I just see over and over again the style as a type of algorithm. Earlier I was just talking about Mondrian, just such a really easy example. His most classic signature style, black and white grid, some cells that are red, yellow, and blue. Right? You can almost distill this into a very, very simple algorithm, and the list of artists that you can sort of take that approach with is, I think, very deep and varied. And so, I'm always looking at these artists and trying to distill sort of a process or a systematic way that they went about creating their artwork. And there are so many ways to do that, and so that's kind of how I learn from other artists, is by evaluating their work in those terms. And so there are many artists that have been a big influence on me, and just have really helped to inform how I make my work. I think that's, I didn't have a super formal art education, and so I think the best ideas I've learned have been by studying the works of other artists.
The Los Angeles County Museum, LACMA in LA, has just opened a very remarkable exhibition, which is really a history of computer art in a way.
Yeah.
And of course, growing up in Switzerland, and then also in my early 20s sort of teaching in Lüneburg at the university, I sort of became early on somehow acquainted with Frida Nake.
Yes.
And also, a Manfred Mohr, of course,
Nice.
is another, now based in the States, but another
Yeah.
German pioneer of that. But the exhibition is really looking at such pioneers from computer art, from many different geographies, many different continents, and it's a great show, very sort of encyclopedia. I mean, it's a very, it's a history, and it's also a protest against forgetting, because there is memory needed. At that moment, there is so much focus on digital art. It's important, that memory. To which extent is this history important for you?
Yeah, that's another interesting question. I think in some ways it's very important, and in some ways it's not important. I think I really respect what those early artists did. I think they had a lot of courage to work with the computer and to believe that it was capable of being a source of important artwork. I think most people at that time really rejected that idea. And so obviously I would not be where I am today without their work. And I think their work very directly inspired other artists like Casey Reese, who built the very tools that I create my artwork with. And so there's a long chain of events that they started that has really enabled me to do what I do. I think in some ways, aesthetically, I haven't connected as deeply with their work. I do love Manfred Mohr's work. I own several of his works, but in some ways, I don't know, I've always looked for a way to make that work a little more human and not be so completely dominated by the computer. I'm interested in, I mentioned the abstract expressionist really struck me, and there's just something so human about their works and so immediate, and they just feel so approachable. And I wanted to try to make work that involved the computer but still had that element of warmth and understanding and sort of visual communication immediately of a particular emotion or feeling. And so, I hope that my work has sort of built on their work by maybe bringing us in that direction a little bit.
And that also goes back to what you said before, that you sort of feel your work started when you brought these two things together. It's almost like an oxymoron.
Yes.
It's two things one wouldn't necessarily bring together. And can you maybe tell us in which of your works, it's always interesting, I think, with an artist, where the catalogue raisonné starts. What's the first work, which is no longer student work or early work, and where you felt sort of happy with? What is the first work where you felt you brought these two worlds together?
Yeah, I remember it very clearly. I had been struggling with exactly how to combine programming with artwork. It's very clear in retrospect, but at the time, I wasn't familiar with generative art, and so I sort of stumbled around. I was kind of clumsily trying to involve mathematics and these kinds of ideas in my drawings, and they just weren't really clicking. And eventually I had the idea, rather than doing these computations by hand, I thought, what if I just try to write a program that creates a painting? And so I sort of sat down and did that, and up until that time I had never really worked on abstract artwork. Everything I did tended to be sort of figurative or realistic in some way. And so this was both my first abstract work and my first fully programmed work where the entire work was created from scratch by a program. And to me, it was just immediately really, really interesting. Of course.
Which year was it?
This was 2014. Yeah, for me, that was immediately, that was my first fully generative work. And I just felt like I was onto something right
and
away.
Maybe for whoever is going to, watch this film or read the interview, it would be interesting for those who are not familiar with generative art, if you would very quickly explain this process and pattern-based, art form.
Yeah.
It's very much, of course, it's art created through a program.
Right.
But it would be great to hear your definition.
Yeah. Okay.
What is actually your definition? What is Tyler Hobbs' definition of generative art?
Perfect. This is right in my wheelhouse. So, I describe generative art as creating artwork systematically or creating artwork through a process, and it's where the artist is thinking more about the procedure or about a system that will create the work, and less about the exact sort of image that's being worked on. I don't think that it's black or white. I think that it exists on a spectrum. I think that generative art you can work in a fully generative fashion, or you can use it only in some components. My particular type of work that I'm most known for is algorithmic work. So I'm writing a program, I'm writing code that generates artwork, and I would consider that very fully generative artwork. But I think it's even possible to make a work that's just done by hand, that doesn't use the computer at all, that is still very much a generative work, so long as the mindset is about working systematically and about crafting that process and crafting the system. And that sort of removes you as the artist from the exact final work, and it often means that you're interjecting randomness or chance or some other element. And that's really at the heart of generative art, because that way of working helps you as the artist escape your own limitations in some way. That element of chance helps you to arrive at certain ideas that you couldn't have accessed with just your own imagination. And it also just helps you to have a different mindset about the work, and really to work in a new and interesting way, at least for me.
Thank you. And that leads me to another question. I started in the 90s a project. We wanted to do a show which would travel more than Family of Man, and a show which would basically could happen anywhere and would be always locally also generated. So we started this project, Do It, where we invited artists to do instructions and recipes and how-to manuals. And it was, of course, very inspired at that time by Yoko Ono, who did the Grapefruit book. It was inspired by someone, another pioneering artist, Alison Knowles. He just has a retrospective now, I think in Berkeley, who is one of the Fluxus pioneers. It was inspired by George Brecht, by John Cage, by this whole Fluxus idea also of the open score, that it's an open score and that it allows also chance to enter. So, and I was also thinking in terms of generative art, and when I read interviews with you, it seems that in a quite similar way, even if it's very, very different, because it's of course programming, but the artist seems to be giving instructions. And I wanted to ask you to talk about that, and also to which extent these instructions are maybe analog, to what Alison Knowles explained to me, open scores.
You're interested in, to what extent am I thinking about giving instructions? And whether they're programmatic or otherwise. And
to which extent they're open also, to which extent
they're open, okay.
Because it seems that with a lot of your work, particularly, we're going to talk about it in a minute, but particularly with some of your works, that there is QQL, for example. There's quite a lot of, for example, like Alison Knowles says, make a salad, right? And so everybody who makes a salad, no matter who and how, makes the piece. So this is very participatory. It goes beyond, basically, Duchamp says it's 50% of the work is done by the viewer. Here at least 50% is on whoever has the instruction can, in that sense, do it. So that's kind of what I meant,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, in some ways, algorithmic arts forces the artist to be very explicit with their instructions. So this is sort of one departure from something like Solowit's instructions, or something like open scores, where they have another artist that is actually executing the work. They can trust another artist to sort of interpret those instructions. The computer, unfortunately, is very dumb in the sense that it can't take ambiguous instructions at all. If you want to have something happen by chance, you have to tell it exactly how things happen by chance. And so even though you're working with randomness and chance, it's like in a very carefully crafted way. So the instructions are very precise when you're working just with the computer. So if I want to have a more open-ended instruction, then something like QQL is where that comes in. Something where the algorithm is it is steered by an individual, or an individual is playing a very curatorial role. I think generative systems and open systems shift a lot of the importance in the creative act to curation. I think curation becomes more and more of an important element as systems become more generative. And so I think that's where kind of having a more open-ended result becomes possible with a generative system.
Now with QQL, obviously the idea is that very much people minted themselves in that sense, so it's a path. And I was told by several people that actually, I was told that they're kind of waiting to, that some people seem to wait to see how other people mint it in order to then, so it creates a kind of an interesting process also. And can you talk a little bit about how that works? Because also the artwork doesn't necessarily seem to be attached, but it's in a way, people have the right to create an artwork.
Yes.
It gives them the right. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. This is one of the really interesting elements of QQL to me, is that by removing myself from the curatorial role here, by turning it over, and also by turning it over in a really open way, it adds an element of time to QQL, and it creates sort of a natural chronological storyline, getting to see how people evolve what they're interested in from the algorithm over time. I think, people had very different motivations on day one of minting at what sort of things they might choose for QQL versus what people are choosing now. And I think 2 years from now, they'll have an entirely different curatorial mindset. And you're right, there's been this sort of pattern of influence and response, and people looking for the gaps that others have ignored. It's interesting. It's really kind of created a set of mini artists, and I'm kind of fascinated to see that like collectors are struggling with some of the same issues that artists struggle with about, I don't know, being afraid to commit to some particular idea, or putting faith in your aesthetic judgments in a very public and permanent way.
Yeah, because once a decision is made, it's kind of irreversible.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, I kind of like flipping that on the collector a little bit, but they also make it possible for me to create that really open-ended project, right? Like I couldn't work with an algorithm like that if it was just me curating it. The result would not be the same. So there's a lot of fascinating consequences of that. Yeah.
Another important moment in your practice is of course the Fidenza moment, and
Sure.
I wanted to ask you to tell us about, if you remember the day you invented that. Mm-hmm. What was the revelation?
Sure. So Fidenza, like most of my works, didn't come out of nowhere. Most of my works are built out of pieces of previous works. This is one of the advantages of working with code, is that you're really cleanly able to take parts and pieces and sort of reinvent them and recombine them and use them in new ways. And so kind of some of the foundation of what Fidenza is built on, this sort of flow field system, I created my version of that on a sketchbook in a coffee shop in 2015. So, and Fidenza didn't happen until 2021. So some of these ideas really built up over time. And once I learned about art blocks and about NFTs and about sort of on-chain, long-form generative artwork, that's where I immediately started thinking about sort of this main concept for Fidenza. And I had one algorithm in particular that I had been playing with that felt like it had the kind of range and depth that was necessary to do something like Fidenza, where it was going to have 999 outputs, which is much, much larger than anything that I had created up to that date. Normally I was looking at capturing 5 or 10 or 15 outputs. So Fidenza was really just a really particular, interesting artistic challenge. But I was lucky that it didn't come from nowhere, that I was able to build off of so much of my previous work to create it. So it's both very new and very much a continuation of my practice.
Now another oxymoron is of course the oxymoron of control and chance.
Yes.
And often I think it's not only with digital art, but I think in a lot of art there is this coming together where artists kind of bring together, they're open for chance, yet at the same time it's a very controlled way of doing that. And that seems to be the case in a lot of your work. And I want to ask you, tell us a little bit about that, in relation to the examples you've just given, but also in general, how chance and control relate. And when we were on our way here, George Haig explained to me that actually also, for example, with Fidenza, there is, of course, randomness involved, yet at the same time, you program, for example, rarity. So the occurrence of certain very rare instances is not completely accidental.
Correct. Yes, correct. Yeah, I think, first of all, I think physical media has a lot of chance built into it really naturally. You can just think, for example, of watercolor, right? Like this is maybe what attracts a lot of artists to working with something like watercolor, is that you don't know precisely what you're going to get, and even though you're giving up some control, you're getting back a certain richness in response. So it's a type of trade-off. And the computer doesn't really like to give you chance in that same way. You have to be very explicit about it. It's kind of it's really unusual with the computer that it doesn't really do things randomly, and yet at the same time you can ask it to use randomness in very specific and powerful ways. And so with something like Fidenza, there's probably 100 different locations in the algorithm where I use randomness in some way to shape different aspects of the work. So it might be large-scale attributes of the work, like what's the scale of the elements we're working with? Is it very calm, or is it very turbulent? Are we working with a really striking color palette or something much more muted? And all the way down to fine details, these sort of fine textures, randomness is used for it. And so I'm using randomness very, very thoroughly in the algorithm, but I'm really considering every single time that I use it exactly how I want to use the randomness. And I tend to be strategic about it, so I'm not making things rare for the sake of making them rare. The way that I went about it was I wanted to see as many examples of something as I thought would be interesting. So if I thought that this particular behavior was only interesting to see 10 times, I would set the probability so that that's how many times we would see it. I didn't want to get bored seeing something sort of repetitive over and over. And that was the approach I took for Fidenza. So the things that I thought had the most variation and the most potential, I used the most. And the things that were a little bit more limited in scope, those ended up being rare only because of that particular behavior.
Thank you. Now you mentioned watercolor, and that brings us, right away to the exhibition here. And I think it's a good moment because we wanted to talk about, the beginnings of your work, about some of the key, moments of revelations, and then about generative art. But we wanted to talk, of course, also about what's here exhibited, because we are here in the middle of the exhibition. And what the show includes lots of different works, and many of these works are actually a collaboration between the machine and the hand, as you explained earlier. And maybe we can begin with the watercolors, which is up here in front of us. It has the title Delicate Futures. What are Delicate Futures?
Delicate Futures is a work, watercolor on paper. This is a work that is kind of rare for the show because it is done entirely by hand. But this is an example, I think, where generative art can extend beyond sort of the narrow vision that some people have for it at this moment in time. I think generative art is about the mentality going into the work and about thinking about creating the work systematically and thinking about sort of a procedural approach to art making. And so in this case, I wanted to use my hand in a very mechanistic way. I wanted to try to work with a really simple, repetitive structure, something that belongs very naturally to the computer, right? This sort of grid-like structure. But I wanted to do it with the hand because I know that the hand has all of these kind of particular characteristics and what we tend to think of as flaws in the way that it's made, right? The lines are not straight. The eye isn't capable of measuring things out perfectly evenly. So things shift a little bit, things are a little soft, things are a little imperfect. And by really using that simple rigid structure, those elements are brought to the forefront. So I was interested in, how can we use the hand in a really mechanical way and what does that show us about what it means to create something by hand?
And next to it is fulfilling system 1 and 2. That's
Yes.
A diptych, and it brings together this question really of the hand and the machine. It's both and.
Yes.
Instead of either or, instead of nor. Can you
Yes.
talk about fulfilling systems? When are systems fulfilling?
Yeah, absolutely. So fulfilling system is a bit of a reference to sort of the very surface level, straightforward goal of these works. So both works are graphite on paper, and I wanted to put to myself the task of covering the sheet evenly with graphite. And I wanted to do that in one case with just the hand alone, and in another case with just the machine alone. And I was really interested in, if I have just such a simple objective and a really straightforward technique for doing it, that would, again, surface the particular qualities of these ways of working. So fulfilling system 1 is done entirely by hand, and it's just so immediately obvious to me that it is done by hand, and it's so rich, even though it's simple, because the hand and the eye tend to make so many mistakes. There are just limitations of the mechanics of how we work. The hand subtly shifts the pressure, and it subtly shifts the speed at which it works and the tilt, and we think we're working in a straight line, but we're actually gradually curving. And so it's this real sort of fingerprint of humanity and of working in a physical human way. And by contrast, fulfilling system 2, which is done entirely with the plotter. It's a really simple 2-axis robot. You put a pen or a pencil in it and give it instructions for something to draw. This used the pencil, mechanical pencil, and just drew vertical lines until the entire sheet of paper was covered. And just like the handmade counterparts, this really reveals so much about how the computer and how the machine works. First of all, it's operating in straight lines. These are the most natural form of movement for both the computer and for the machine. But even in a system that theoretically should be very perfect and uniform, it's just full of a richness of marks that come from all of the flaws in that mechanical process as well. You start to see traces and hints of the motors and of the manufacturing of the sticks of graphite in the pencil, and in the manufacturing of the paper and even the wood that was underneath the paper. And so it has, again, this very distinct sort of mechanical fingerprint, and by using such a really simple structure, I felt that there was nothing else there for those elements to hide behind. They came immediately to the front. And so to me, it's just a really lovely, clear example of the way these two worlds are different, and just how different the aesthetic can be.
And these two worlds, which are, in the diptych, in a way shown, come then together in a work like Jacquard Legacy, where
Yes.
you kind of combine it all on one canvas. Can you tell us about Jacquard Legacy and also the
Yeah,
title? I
sure.
was kind of interested in knowing more, because
Yeah.
all the works have title in the show, from fulfilling system, to flow interpretation,
Sure.
to user space, to return one,
Sure.
to what we just see here, the Jacquard Legacy. Yeah.
Yes.
So it would be great to hear more about that work, but also about the role of titles.
Absolutely, okay.
And writing, because titles are of course a form of writing, and I know that you also write texts.
Yes, yeah. I mean, titles are really tricky. I feel like it's a very compact form of poetry in some ways, which can be difficult when you're a visual artist. It doesn't necessarily come naturally. And I'm also sort of sensitive with titles about how much that changes the viewer's perception of the work. I want the works to operate at a visual level primarily, and so I don't want the title to be something that interferes too much with the user taking a direct visual approach to interpreting the work. Ideally, it's something that doesn't have too strong of a flavor to it, and so I tend to choose titles that maybe don't have such a strong influence. Jacquard Legacy, probably not too many people know about the Jacquard loom, which is really a precursor to computers. This was in the late 1800s. They started to develop this technology around programmable looms, and the Jacquard loom was sort of the first instance of programming a machine to create something. And so textiles and computers have been, woven together since the very early days. And in that ways, I find something a very nice generative connection between my work and many textile works. So this is a bit of a reference to that because I feel that in some ways this pattern has elements of a textile to it, and it's the kind of thing that would probably work very naturally with a programmable loom. In this case, the design of Jacquard Legacy is fully algorithmic, so I wrote the code to create the design. The algorithm decided the colors and the sizes and the placement of every shape. And the physical work is executed by hand. So I used the plotter to help me position every mark. I used it to sort of mark the center point of every mark in this painting. I think there's something like 40,000 dots in this painting.
40,000, wow.
Yeah, 40,000. I didn't count them until after I was done with the painting, and I probably would not have done the painting if I had counted them first. So I chose to paint this by hand for a couple of reasons. One is, first of all, that it's quite difficult to paint well with the machine. There's a lot of touch that goes into how the brush is loaded and unloaded that's just very difficult to do effectively at scale on a work. And so part of it was pragmatic. Another part of it that I thought was really interesting was taking this design that's in some ways very stiff and repetitive, and using the hand because the hand and the eye do introduce so much natural variation. And that variation, I find, just adds a real richness to the work. I think it gives you something to appreciate in every corner and detail of the work, and it gives depth to the work, and it gives warmth to the work, and I think it helps to make it much more relatable and humane. And so I thought that that was really my motivation for combining those two elements in this work.
Now, as we record this conversation behind us, and
sure.
I think everybody's going to see that, it's the backdrop to the interview. So it would be important to talk about by proxy.
Yes.
In different colors, and you mentioned before that in by proxy, it's maybe the key example in the show where you do with the hand what you couldn't do with the computer.
Exactly.
And you do with the computer what you couldn't do by hand. So
exactly.
Maybe it's a good moment to explain that. What can you do by hand,
right.
what the computer can't do, and what can you do with the computer what you couldn't do by hand?
Sure, absolutely. So these works, the by proxy works, these are all graphite and chalk pastel on paper. The portion that's done by machine is the graphite, and the portion that's done by hand is the chalk pastel. And you have to get pretty close to really be able to appreciate this about the graphite marks, but they're made out of very rigid, straight, perfectly spaced lines of graphite, in some cases lines, other cases grids. And it's just simply impossible to draw in that manner by hand. You could use the most precise measurements and markings, and you just wouldn't be able to replicate that consistency in pressure and in spacing. And so it's really out of reach by hand, but it's incredibly easy for the machine to do this sort of things. It really excels at this type of mark making. And on the other hand, the chalk pastel is really full of freedom and gesture and character, and these are things that come so easily to the hand, right? Like these are the kind of marks that a small child could probably make, but are nearly impossible to get a computer and a machine to make effectively. And so it's just such a stark difference to me, the kinds of strengths that they have. And so these were really, the works in the show that placed those two elements in the most direct juxtaposition and sort of a more contrasting way, but hopefully I think they work as a really nice pairing as well. I hope that they, in some ways, support each other.
Another series are the Connected for the Moment works, and
yes.
They exist basically as NFTs. The dimensions of the NFT are actually here 0 centimeter by 0 centimeter, which is fascinating. Nice. So there is the NFT, which is 0 centimeter by 0 centimeter, but then...
I should keep that dimension, I really like that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, I've never seen this, yeah. So there is a 0 centimeter by 0 centimeter NFT connected for the moment, and then a very similar work, which again is of course digitally invented, but then actually hand painted, is the MEM CPI horizons.
Yeah, memcopy horizons.
Exactly. Can you talk about these, because here
sure.
You basically show very similar works, but in different forms of appearance. They make a different appearance. One appears as an NFT and one appears as a painting, and maybe also the moment to talk a little bit about the difference and what it means for you to show here in the exhibition these works also as NFTs.
Yeah, absolutely. So I felt that it was important to show some works in the show that were purely digital for a couple of reasons. So one is that's been really big component of my work, and although most of the show is physical, many people at this point know me for my purely digital work, and out of the total body of work that I've made, the vast majority of it is purely digital. And I thought that it was important to show, in this case, that even if it is fully digital, that I'm still using a lot of the ideas from the hand and from the analog world. Sort of the basis of the algorithm that those were created from came from me thinking about curves and the way that we draw curves by hand. It seems like such a simple thing that we just take it for granted when we draw, but whenever you try to program something like that, whenever you try to think systematically about a curve, it's actually a very, very difficult challenge. And so I was really interested in, when you draw by hand, it's not a straight line. It tends to deviate in some way. And what are kind of the systematic ways in which the hand deviates away from a straight line? So this algorithm is built around that and around warping the curves in particular ways. And that gives it a sort of human character to it, even though it's completely made by an algorithm and it exists in a completely digital space. And I'm always interested in trying to transport elements of sort of the analog world to the digital world, back and forth. I always find it interesting to blend the two. And so, again, I thought it was important to show that that can exist even in a purely digital way. However, there's something, to me, still really special about the relationship we have physically with a work. Whenever you're able to view a work, especially if it's large scale and something that has rich texture, the way that we physically relate to that work is very different from the way that we relate to digital works. I think it has to do with this kind of infinite richness and detail. You can sort of look as close as you want and find something to appreciate, and that doesn't typically exist in a digital environment. I think it's the way that the work responds to the environment around you. You can move around, look at different aspects of it. It's responsive to the lighting and the scale of it. It can fill your full range of vision, and you can really engulf yourself in the work, immerse yourself in the work. And so I think that gives a certain power to a physical work that's hard to replicate in a purely digital work right now. And so I wanted to explore taking some of those same algorithmic ideas, and it's well spotted. It is a very closely it's a very closely related algorithm between the NFTs and the charcoal drawing. But I think it's a very different experience viewing the two.
And this sort of transfer from analog to digital, does that also occur with something which actually appears to be a pure painting, Return 1, right?
Yeah, so Return 1 is, this is a piece that began as an algorithmic design. So this is actually one that has the least intervention by hand, effectively no direct intervention by hand. So purely algorithmic work, which was executed using an airbrush mounted on sort of a large-scale CNC machine or a large-scale plotter. And here, I was able to create a type of painting that you simply can't create by hand. There's no way to use the airbrush with the level of consistency that you need to make these types of marks. You have to maintain constant height, constant velocity, constant air pressure and needle position. And so this, again, by using the machine, it really sort of extends the reach of my hand to works that were not accessible to me or to others before. And this kind of ties into the title of the show, right? Like I consider these machines an extension of myself and like a new type of hand that's able to accomplish things that the hands I was born with are not able to. But just because I'm working with the machine does not mean that that it's sort of making the aesthetic judgments, right? As the artist, you have to devote a lot of time to crafting the tool, rather than spending the time executing the work physically yourself. You're spending all of your time crafting the tool and the system. So I spent many, many hours fine-tuning exactly how the airbrush would move, at what speed, at what height, at what air pressure. How would it open and close the nozzle? How many layers? How would the spacing on the fill pattern work? These are all considerations that were really, really carefully crafted. So, even though it has this sort of really tight consistency, it's all sort of exactly what I wanted as the artist as well. So it's, that may surprise people who think that just because you're using a machine, that it's like removes the challenges of making the artwork.
I think that's a great conclusion of that second chapter, about the show. And I have just 2 or 3 last questions.
Sure.
One is I've had different conversations recently with Ian Chang, with IX Shells, about this idea of the artwork being a living organism, connected almost to plant life, connected to, living organisms in nature, and how through that, obviously, the work is infinite, or it's not, it's sort of like continues to evolve. And I was kind of wondering, because obviously painting or a drawing at a certain moment doesn't move anymore.
Right.
And I was curious in terms of your work with algorithms, to which extent you're also interested in this, in actually certain works being living organisms.
Yeah.
Because it seems to change the status of the artwork
in
our time, no?
It does, it does. Yeah, this is something I think that's particularly relevant to QQL, right? A project which is sort of unbounded and designed to evolve over time. I fully expect it to continue to evolve long after I'm dead. And I think it's really interesting to compare it to a living system like a plant or an ecosystem, because there's a real generative element to everything in nature, right? Like plants are sort of operating on a very basic program. It's a genetic program written into their DNA. And so there's something about generative artwork that really taps into the natural world, even though we're coming at it from this very artificial reference point of using computers and using programming. It's really interesting to me how it does end up telling us a lot about these really natural ideas. And to me, it's kind of always been a goal to extend the reach of a particular generative idea to something that can be more infinite. My first works, they were maybe interesting for one output, and then as I got a little more experienced, I could make them interesting for 3 or for 5 or for 10. And Fidenza felt like a huge step to make it interesting for 999 outputs. And I think that there's sort of an ideal of making a system that's sort of infinitely interesting and continues to surprise and continues to show you something new, but still contains a cohesive line of thought. And I don't know if that's even possible to accomplish, but it's something that I definitely think about as an interesting potential endpoint for generative art.
Last question is, I'm always interested in unrealized projects, because we know a great deal about architects' unrealized projects because they publish them as part of architectural competitions, but we know very little about artists, poets, novelists, many different other practitioners' unrealized projects. And the range or scope of the unrealized can be wide. Some projects are too big to be realized, too time intense to be realized, too expensive. Some projects are too small to be realized. Some projects are utopic, dreams, are unrealizable.
Right.
Some projects are censored. And Doris Lessing always told me also there are projects which we might want to do but don't dare to do. That's kind of like maybe self-censorship. So within this whole range of the unrealized, the ambiguous, I just want to ask you, maybe tell us about one of your favorite unrealized projects.
Oof, that's it's an interesting question. It's a hard one. I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind, I guess I'll talk about is I've had this idea about a mural generator algorithm that anybody could use with a photo of the side of a building and plug it into the algorithm, and it would immediately give back instructions and a design for a mural that could be painted on that building, and that would fit within the the aspect ratio of the walls and deal with all of the windows and all of the sort of obstructions on that wall. For me, that's a really interesting challenge for a couple of reasons. One is I actually really love public artwork. I've made a few murals and I plan to continue making them. I love artwork that's just out in the world for everybody to enjoy as part of their day, and that there's no obstruction between them and the artwork. I also love the idea of this challenge of making the program that's entirely responsive to an unpredictable environment. Right? There's so many variations on buildings, and just from an artistic challenge perspective, it would be fascinating to try to write something that was capable of tackling that. And that's a type of infinite.
I want to say that goes back to that.
Yeah. So it's a really hard one. I mean, I might get there, but so far I haven't gotten there. I just keep thinking about it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
It was a great interview. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all.